Well, hello everybody and good morning. Welcome to this fabulous session that we're putting on. I'm so pleased to be here with you and really looking forward to this policy briefing session. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Carol Schwartz, Chair of Tuala Foundation and Women's Leadership Institute Australia, and I'm also the very proud Chair of the Climate Council. To begin, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the traditional lands on which we're all placed around Australia. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation where I am today and offer my respects to their elders and to all First Nations people with us today. I want to recognise their deep and enduring custodianship of country and to particularly honour First Nations female leaders who continue to advocate for their communities. I want to thank our amazing founding partner, the University of Melbourne, who has, as always, helped develop this event, and to celebrate our 7 other wonderful university partners, QUT, UNSW, Charles Darwin University, University of Adelaide, University of Canberra, University of Tasmania, and University of Western Australia. We could not be prouder than having these collaborations with our university partners. And note that today's session will be recorded and a recording will be shared after the event. Now, a little bit of context for the session. A warm welcome to all of you as we actually celebrating 10 years of Pathways to Politics for Women program. Today's event takes place after a very busy electoral year and as we now heading towards a federal election, date of which is still to be announced. But just to give you a sense of our momentum, last year we had over 120 of our alumni running and 49 were successful. In Western Australia, 6 alums from the inaugural cohort ran in the very recent state election, and currently at least 23 of our alumni are going to be running in the upcoming federal election. Congratulations to all of you, to all of our alumni who are stepping into the political arena. We know it really takes tremendous courage, resilience, and lots of hard work, and we're really proud of your efforts. And as you know, we are always here standing shoulder to shoulder with you in your pursuit of political leadership. So I am so delighted to be able to introduce our wonderful guest expert, Amanda McKenzie. I've been now the chairman of the Climate Council for 2.5 years, and it's been my absolute pleasure working with Amanda. The Climate Council is independent and evidence-led. It is focused on shaping the national conversation and putting climate change at the top of the political agenda, calling out mis- and disinformation, and advocating for evidence-based solutions. We have the most wonderful council made up of climate experts who really are at the top of their game. Amanda McKenzie, who I have the pleasure of working with, is a prominent Australian environmental leader and one of the best-known public commentators on the climate crisis in Australia. Back in 2013, she worked with Professor Tim Flannery at the Climate Commission. With support from some of Australia's leading scientists, she co-founded the 100% independent and people-backed Climate Council. It was Australia's largest crowdfunding campaign at the time. Amanda has led the organisation brilliantly as its CEO for the last 10 years. She also co-founded the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and has served on renewable energy expert panels for the Queensland and Northern Territory governments. During our session today, Amanda is going to outline key facts on climate policy considerations and climate change, explain current global and local trends, and how to communicate on climate and energy issues effectively, which is so crucial for those seeking political leadership. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Carol, for that lovely introduction, and it's wonderful to be here with you all. at a time when I'm sure that you are thinking deeply about your political leadership in a world in flux and in Australia in flux as we go to a federal election where there may well be changes in our political leadership. I think the role of women in our democracy is so important, and it's wonderful to see all of you stepping into these. And I know you've been stepping into them for many years, important leadership roles. So I'm going to share my screen and I'll go through sort of the top line of what my presentation is going to be looking at today. So as Carol said, I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to talk about climate science and impacts, but I'm going to look at it just through one lens of a recent event that we all witnessed, the Cyclone Alfred. Talk a little bit about global trends and then move into talking about climate policy, which is, I'm sure, on many of your minds as we go toward the election and think about how to integrate the many policy areas that we need to be tackling in Australia. And then, as Carol said, touching on communications. I'll try and just keep it brief. And then at the end, Sarah, when she sends around this recording, we'll also have some additional resources that you can draw upon if that's useful for you. So just to go to the latest climate science, as you probably know, the climate crisis is now all around us. 2024 was the hottest year on record, but it's been it was following many other hottest year on record. So the whole period of 2015 to 2024 are the hottest 10 years on record. And indeed, if you are under 40 years old, you haven't experienced an average year of global temperature. You've only experienced above average years. And increasingly, those years in the last 10 years are the hottest on record and then the hottest on record again. So what does that mean is that the global system is much more energetic. There's more heat in the system. A hotter world is a wetter world. You just need to think about stepping into the shower. When it's hot, you see more of that steam just sitting around in the atmosphere. Our world is hotter. It means there is more moisture in the atmosphere. So the hotter, wetter world is driving more unprecedented extreme weather events. And you'd be forgiven for thinking there's a bit of climate whiplash. We see these very extreme flooding and heavy rainfall events, and then we're seeing fire and heat. So just over the summer, you would have noticed the terrible fires in LA. And of course, those fires were in winter. They were driven by extremely dry conditions, above average temperatures, as well as the winds that LA usually experiences in winter. But whereas they would usually be driving cool conditions, they were driving these fires. And of course, it shocked the world because the fires were able to reach so far into the suburbs and affected so many people's homes. In other parts of the world, including Australia, been experiencing catastrophic flooding. So in the US as well, many parts of the US, not long before these fires, we had seen Hurricane Milton and other severe hurricanes affecting the southeast of the US. We've also experienced that, of course, here, and that's what I'll get into now. I thought I'd do a little bit of a case study because I think when you get into talking about the climate science, you can get into a bit of a laundry list of the myriad of ways that the climate crisis is now affecting us all. Because it is a global system, it does affect all weather in a variety of different ways. So given that Cyclone Alfred has just happened, and I think we were all watching with some concern as it was heading towards southeast Queensland, obviously a very large population centre, and would affect the region across the northern rivers and inland into southeastern Queensland, but to the west. I think we were all very concerned about what that impact would be. So when you look at an event like Cyclone Alfred, at the Climate Council, we look at the ways in which climate change has now influenced these weather events. And it's best not to use the word cause when you talk about climate change, because any weather event is caused by lots of different factors, natural and human exacerbated, if you like. So a cyclone is driven by really warm water Um, and the Coral Sea, where Cyclone Alfred formed, was extremely hot. It had been the hottest few months on record for the Coral Sea where the cyclone formed. And cyclones need warm water to form, about 27 degrees. But cyclones, of course, have formed at lots of different times, and the direction of a cyclone is influenced mainly by the weather systems that surround that cyclone. And there's a lot of complexity in how a cyclone forms and the extent of the severity of it. But the important thing for us to note is that because cyclones are primarily driven by ocean heat and moisture, we have put a huge amount of extra heat into our oceans. Actually, with the global temperature rising, most of that heat is going into the ocean. I've got a statistic here that helps you sort of get it in your mind. It's about 5 Hiroshima bombs every second of heat that is going into the ocean. It's a huge amount of energy. So the Coral Sea, as I said, which is off the coast of Queensland, was very hot. This is where the cyclone formed. But what's really unusual about the cyclone is, of course, that it tracked so far south. Now, that cyclone was pushed by weather systems, a low pressure system over Australia to the south of the cyclone, but it was able to keep being sustained by the ocean heat to the south because water temperatures off Brisbane, off the southeast of Australia, were very warm, much warmer than they would have been prior to the climate crisis. And of course, there is always natural variation. You might have a hot year here and a cool year here. But what we are seeing is that temperatures in our oceans, as well as our land temperatures, are going up and up and up with a consistent curve. So the long-term temperature trend is more heat in the ocean and on the land. So what does that mean for these communities that experience Cyclone Alfred? Well, as I said, you've got a hotter, wetter atmosphere. The atmosphere holds more water than it used to. And for every degree of global warming, and 1 degree of global warming doesn't necessarily sound like much, but the whole of the global atmosphere can hold more than 7% more water than it used to. And we're now at 1.5 degrees global warming. So the atmosphere is actually holding a lot more water than it used to. So when there is a rain event, there is a greater likelihood that it can trigger a very extreme rainfall event because there is actually more water there. Now, of course, a cyclone is in its nature fueling extreme rainfall, and that cyclone itself, Cyclone Alfred, was holding more water than it otherwise would have. But also we're seeing cyclones move more slowly, and there's a number of complex reasons for that in terms of wind at the tropics and how that's working, which I won't get into. But what is being observed by scientists is cyclones are moving more slowly, and that's why we were all waiting with bated breath. Is it ever going to reach the coast? Is it going to go somewhere else? And what that means is if the cyclone is over an area for longer, it can dump more rain over that location. So that's what we saw in this cyclone. The cyclone held more water and then it dumped slowly over these regions. So we were very lucky in a place like Lismore that it didn't actually break the levee in terms of the amount of rainfall that fell. Obviously, a range of areas around Lismore was flooded, but it wasn't as catastrophic as this 2022. But in many areas across southeast Queensland and New South Wales, they experienced extremely high rainfall. So Harvey Bay, you probably heard about the rain bomb in Harvey Bay, 100 millimetres in a single hour. Dorrigo had almost 900 millimetres in a week. So extremely wet conditions for those areas, which resulted in flooding in many places. The other thing I wanted to highlight was the waves. So the global sea level has risen by 20 centimetres. That's because of melting from glaciers, as well as the Arctic, for instance, and that warm water is bigger than cooler water. So essentially we have 20 centimetres more, the sea is 20 centimetres higher than it previously was, which means that when you do see a storm surge or a very destructive storm, that there is more water sloshing around that can be pushed onto the coast. So during Cyclone Alfred, you would have seen photos of the Gold Coast and other places where sand was gouged off the beaches, which is very costly, of course, particularly if you want to regenerate those beaches and bring back the sand, you would have seen pictures of Broadbeach in the Gold Coast with cliffs of sand. So again, because the cyclone was so slow, it sustained those incredibly large swells for longer, which made the impact more severe. And the diagram that we have there on the left just tries to illustrate why it is different. So the first picture is you have a general high tide, and it's not affecting the house. You then have a storm surge that's coming from a storm or a cyclone. That is means all of that water from the ocean is getting pushed by wind towards the sea. So inherently it is higher. But then you add sea level rise in the far side of that diagram, and you see it makes it higher than it would otherwise have been. So that's why sea level rise is exacerbating these sorts of events. What does it mean for communities? I think the really important point to draw out here is that communities are being battered over and over again. So, particularly Southeast Queensland and Northern New South Wales have had a very difficult 5 years. Many areas were affected by a black summer through 2019, 2020. They have also been affected by the 2022 floods, which is the worst disaster in Australia's history and the most costly disaster. And then every local government area that was facing disaster for Alfred had also experienced those two disasters in the 5 years previously. So many of those communities were still under disaster orders from the previous floods, and now they haven't recovered, and they're having to clean up from the next one. Each time that we hear about one of these events, it gets described as unprecedented or a once in a 50-year event or a once in a 100-year event. But of course, they're happening in quick succession. So the cost of extreme weather for Australia has doubled in the last 50 years, and that's particularly concentrated in some areas like Northern New South Wales and Queensland, Southeast Queensland, which have always been places where you would experience floods. But the flooding is happening more frequently. It's more severe, more damaging. And now we have a greater likelihood of things like cyclones, which were just affecting the northern part of Australia, coming further south. So for Australia, we need to be very conscious of being prepared for worsening disasters, but also tackling the climate crisis, which I'll get into in a minute. But I just wanted to put a human face on this because I think it can feel a bit like statistics. This is Peter Lake, who's a cattle farmer in Grafton. And he's one of those people that in the last 5 years have just experienced these back-to-back flooding events as well as fire. He's also had a year of drought on his property. He's really gone through the ringer. And he's been a farmer in that region for generations and has not seen anything like this. Well, his insurance premium increased to $5,000 a year in 2022 and then to $19,000 in 2023. So he wasn't able to completely insure his property and his equipment, his home and contents, because he just couldn't afford it. And we have many people like him across communities who are heavily affected by extreme weather that are underinsured or are not insured because they simply can't afford it. And this is a big sleeper issue for Australia. Many people that will be destitute as a consequence of the climate crisis, making extreme weather events just become unbearable. People cannot cope with the frequency and the recovery costs that come over and over again, which raises very difficult questions for us to think about where people are living, in what conditions. Already the government has bought back certain properties, for instance, in Lismore as one example. So it's very much here and now that we need to be coping with it. So why is it all happening? I'm sure you're very aware of this, but the climate crisis is driven by climate pollution. Essentially, the pollution from coal, oil and gas creates a blanket over the world that traps heat. And that heat, as I had mentioned, goes into the ocean, it's on the land, and raises global temperature. Australia is a significant polluter. We often hear we're just 1%. Well, there's 197 countries polluting, and we are the 15th largest polluter. So we are a significant player. We are also one of the largest exporters of coal and gas. And I think the way to think about this is what an opportunity Australia has, because we are a big player in this. We are heavily affected by the consequences of the climate crisis. So we have agency. The world is in flux, of course, as you know, and just to touch on this, there is a huge, while global pollution is increasing and global temperature is rising, there is a huge emphasis on solutions now. Renewables are forecast to expand from 30% to 46% by the end of this decade. So there's exponential growth across the good things, the solutions to the climate crisis, and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. But at the same time, we are holding two realities of solving the problem, but the problem getting worse. And of course, the Trump coming into office is where the world is in flux around this, but it was also climate change, like many other issues. You sort of take one step forward, two step back. You might have some steps sideways. I think Trump is obviously backing away from climate action at a rapid pace, but there are indications that the UK, that the EU will be doing more on this front, but also China is already ahead in the clean energy race. So what does all of this mean for Australia, that this is an issue that is going to dominate the 21st century and it is going to be affecting us so significantly? So I like to think about it as Australia's critical opportunity. We are already moving to tackle the climate crisis. 40% of our power comes from renewables. 4 million Australian families have panels on their roof. I'm sure many of you probably do. And our aging coal-fired generators are actually retiring. They will all be retired in the next 15 years. So regardless of climate change, we have to replace the bulk of our energy system anyway. We have enormous reserves of the key metals that are required for a clean energy revolution: lithium, silver, copper. And we have the capacity to make things here. We're the sunniest country in the world. We're one of the windiest. We could be using that advantage in clean, cheap power to create a range of different manufactured products, taking our raw materials like iron ore into the other sorts of metals that we could be exporting. Steel, there's opportunities in green aluminium, there's opportunities in lithium, there's opportunities in a whole range of different things, batteries, etc. We did a big piece of analysis in the policy realm at the start of 2024, looking at what the government was currently intending to do across every sector of the Australian economy and what were their remaining opportunities to slash our climate pollution. The pink boxes here across each sector show what the government is already doing, and the yellow boxes are the additional opportunities that we found that could help us to slash climate pollution. And we're particularly orientated around technology that is already available because we have to move quickly. So this is called Seize the Decade, our analysis, and I'll put it in the follow-up piece that Sarah will email out, because I think it is quite useful for policymakers. Each of these boxes has additional policy suggestions that surround it. But ultimately, clean electricity is the foundation. We need to be powering everything, our homes, business, transport, with renewables. And we need a lot of more homes with solar panels, and we need a lot more batteries that are helping to store the power when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, to enable us to continue using renewables. Industry is a big ticket item. We can be helping industry to transition already away from fossil fuel use in processes to more renewables, as well as more efficient industrial processes. But as I mentioned, these are the potential export industries of the future for Australia. The 21st century will be looking for those countries that can be exporting green steel, aluminium, lithium, iron, green hydrogen. So this is the big opportunity for Australia, which is already receiving a range of investment from private and government sources. And then transport is another big ticket item, using more shared active transport, more electric vehicles. And I think the top line is that we have those solutions already available to us. And in the report Seize the Decade, it goes into a lot of depth across every sector in the Australian community to show that we have the solutions available now. I wanted to draw attention, though, to some additional work that we've done, 10 popular policies. So this work, we orientated around climate policies that also reduce costs for households, create jobs, build the industries for the future. So no, for many candidates, obviously cost of mind is top of mind, because that's what's top of mind in the electorate. So that's what we are focused on as well. So what do Australians think? I'm conscious of time, so I'll just whip through this, but if I'll send the presentation around afterwards if you want to look at it in more detail. Basically, climate change is a big concern. It is sustained as a concern now over a decade. And you can see that the extremely concerned group is growing, but it's the vast majority of the Australian population. The pace of climate action, most people think that Australia is moving too slowly or at about the right pace. And I think what we've noticed is that this is increasing, that people think that we are moving too slowly. So there is definitely appetite for change. And there's appetite for more renewables. Australians are extremely supportive of renewables across both regional and suburban demographics, and indeed across all demographics. So particularly solar and wind, and increasingly storage as well. So this is my last slide, just for you to peruse. These are the ways in which the Climate Council can support you, our research, our policy that I've mentioned. We also have a range of tools that help you find out information for your area around either renewables or climate impacts. And then we have a whole lot of communications resources that you can utilise to work out how to communicate around these things. So I'll pass back to you, Carol.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. That was fantastic. Climate is such a huge political issue, and of course, policies and government action are going to, do play such an integral role, and will continue to play such an integral role. And I guess for our alumni as current and future politicians, you will be making decisions on this really crucial issue for us as a nation. And it's to that end that we really wanted to equip you with current, up-to-date information on which you're going to be making those decisions. And I have to say that the Climate Council, as you can see, has all that information for you and available to you at any time. So thanks once again, Amanda, for that really, really comprehensive presentation. Really appreciate that. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I think in your role as political leaders, both current and future, you are so aware of the critical issues for us as a nation. And I think that statistics that Amanda has shown us is that Australians are really concerned about climate and want to be making a contribution, not only for us, but also for the globe and for future generations. So thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at our next briefing session.